Hi, I'm Femi OK, and you're in the stream. Today, El Salvador's gangland. Rivalry between gangs and a police crackdown have made the country the world's deadliest not at war. Is there a way out? As we've been reaching out to our online community, we've been doing that in Spanish and in English. It gives you a sense of how large the problem is, how many countries it actually involves. Malika Bilal, what do you have?
Right, several countries and of course the diaspora here in the United States. So while some people online are saying, what's the best way to get out of this problem, address this problem? Many people say, we'll take it straight to the gangs themselves.
Right.
And Angel on Twitter explains why that may not be such a good idea. He says, up until recently, I would absolutely have encouraged complete decimation of the gangs. But this is bigger than that. He goes on to say these gangs are very powerful and extremely terrifying, and that's why families are fleeing El Salvador. So, of course, we want to hear from you wherever you are. You can join this conversation with hashtag AJStream.
Hi, I'm Rafael Goedmer. I'm researcher at the Global Democracy and Transformation program in Lima, and I'm in the stream.
Rape, control, kill. That's the mantra of MS-13, one of El Salvador's biggest gangs. And that's exactly what they're doing in El Salvador, Central America, and the United States. The gang and others like it started in Los Angeles, California, a way for Salvadorian immigrants fleeing civil war to survive the tough transition to a new country. Their crimes got many deported from the US, so they took their networks of violence and extortion back to their home country. El Salvador now has as many as 70,000 gang members, driving murder rates to record highs this year. The government calls them terrorists, giving police a free hand to deal with them. Peacemakers are calling for dialogue, though, but hardliners say the only solution is annihilation. To help us better understand what's happening, we're joined by Roberto Fuentes Francisco Alshul, El Salvador's ambassador to the United States. Alex Sanchez is a former MS-13 member and now Executive Director of Hombres Unidos, helping kids avoid a life of violence in Los Angeles. In San Salvador, Maria Jose Benitez is a UNICEF consultant for child protection. And in Guatemala City, Elizabeth Kennedy is a sociologist and Fulbright scholar who interviewed hundreds of children and families about gang life in El Salvador. So welcome, everybody. Good to have you here. I'm going to start with a story. Maria's story. Maria, you were kidnapped at the beach. Can you tell us about that story? What happened to you and who kidnapped you?
Yes, well, it was a really bad experience for me because it was last year. I was with some friends at the beach, and it was in the evening, and suddenly, like 20 men came to the house. They passed over the wall, and they surrounded us with some guns, and so it was like an express kidnap because it was during 2 hours, and they said that someone had told them that we had a certain amount of money, but we didn't. I mean, we just had like the things we needed for the beach, and at the end, they left with all of our belongings, the things that we had there, like our cell phones and clothing, and then they said that we shouldn't call the police. I mean, for me, it was bad because I was scared for the whole time. But at the same time, as I am a consultant on prevention of violence, I learned from that because until that moment, I wasn't aware of, or I wasn't able to feel what people feel when they get in the situation. At the same time, the people told us not to call the police, but we did. We called and we had took the leap of faith. I mean, because we called the police and we had a very good response because they came really fast, and then they started the process. That the next day, people from the police and from the general attorney started calling me to offer me their services.
How common is this? You described it as an express kidnap, almost quite casually. How common is that something like that would happen to your neighbors and to your family?
Well, there are different types of things that happen. Sometimes people may be maybe in their cars, and someone will come and get into their cars and force them to go to to get some cash from the bank, for example.
Okay.
It's not that it happens every day and not everywhere, because the government has made a map, for example, of specific places where these things is commonly happening. But it's not everywhere, but we try to get the security measures all the time to stay out of risk.
Okay, so it's a couple of things that Maria said, Alex. So express kidnapping, so it's just for a couple of hours and then she was let go. And then there's a map of sort of areas where you can't go because there's a lot of gang activity happening. Can you explain to us what kind of person would actually gang up on Maria and kidnap her for a couple of hours?
Well, you heard specifically that somebody had told them that there was a pocket of money in her home.
Sure.
And usually that's kind of what happens. Individuals that flash money, individuals that make themselves targets sometimes. But the real bottom line is the necessity of the lack of employment that many of these people have in El Salvador. There's a big percentage of young men, primarily, that don't have employment. How are they going to take care of themselves? How are they going to take care of their families? And they have seen the gangs have become the employee. You have children now getting involved in gangs where they're just lookouts and they're getting paid.
Sure.
So those are issues critical. And I feel for Maria and her experience. You know, I was also a target of a kidnapping in Guatemala, in which I was going to get executed because I had gang tattoos when I was coming as an immigrant. So I know what it is to also be a victim because I was a migrant and they thought that I had more money.
Sure.
Elizabeth, you heard Alex give us some of the reasonings behind why someone would do that. We got this tweet in from Real News, and they asked a slightly similar question. Why is it so appealing to join these types of gangs? And Elizabeth, I know you've talked to hundreds of people in El Salvador about this issue in particular. What are some of the things that people tell you about the appeal and why they might want to?
Well, the reality of the gangs in El Salvador is that they offer several things that the state traditionally has not provided. The ambassador is correct that we do, for the first time, have a second left-wing administration in El Salvador. But there's extreme inequality in the country. So many of the families I interviewed had to live on between $150 to $300 a month, which is nearly impossible. There's often a lack of economic opportunities, as Alex just mentioned. There aren't jobs. There's a lack of educational opportunities. And the gangs provide these things. They provide a good paying job in places that don't have them. The gangs provide a social support system in places where the state hasn't been able to operate. And they also provide a means of advancement in a career that may not exist in other jobs. About 60% of Salvadoran society works in the informal economy and can find it quite difficult to get a job, period, much less be able to advance and make a living wage. So, you know, as much bad as some of the gangs do, they do provide these positive benefits as well.
Ambassador, are you squirming as you're listening to this? This is all about your home country, and there are we're hearing lots of context and empathy here for gang members. How do you and your administration see this?
Yes, but first I would like to take exception with one of the comments that were made in your introductory piece.
Go ahead.
Regarding that the police and the security forces have a free hand to do whatever they want to combat the gangs. That is absolutely not true. There was a law that was passed by the Assembly which provided so that any people, any individual, any citizen, including members of the security forces, if they killed anybody as self-defense, they would not go to jail. But the president vetoed the law. It's the first and only veto that he has done. So that law is not a law anymore. So it is not true that the security forces people have the free range to act without impunity. That is not true. I wanted to make that clear. Having said that, I would say that the gang situation is a very complex situation. It has to do with a lot of factors. It has to do with the breakdown of the family structure because of immigration. It has to do with lack of opportunities. I think that is a fundamental issue, which has been mentioned both by Alex and Elizabeth. It has to do increasingly with the relationship of certain elements of the gangs with the drug trafficking. So it is a very complex situation. And that is why it's not an easy one to address. And it is something that will not be addressed, unfortunately, in 1, 2, or 3 years. This is going to take a long process. But I think we are on the right path because we have a comprehensive strategy, not only persecuting crime, but also prevention of violence, rehabilitation and reintegration of those members of the gangs that want to come back to society, attention to the victims, and strengthening of our own institutional framework, including, and very importantly, prison reform.
Alex, what do you want to say?
Well, I think that although the ambassador is true what he says, there has been an inciting by law enforcement to avenge any other officer that has been killed in the line of duty. And what we've seen, an incident that happened in March 22nd, the day of the Peace March, 24th, I think it was. There was a big peace march in El Salvador. At dawn, there were 9 individuals that were executed, and they said that there were gang members. Now, one of them was kidnapped from a home, and this is like the report said. They said that they died in a confrontation with law enforcement. But autopsy reports from different investigating officers, it stated that they had gunpowder in the ceiling of their mouth and in their temple. That meant that there was
So let's broaden this out a little bit, because that's one instant, and then we can't judge on one instant. But generally, the relationship between the police and the local communities or the gang members is what? How would you characterize that?
Well, I think that that's the issue when you don't have law enforcement in certain communities where the gangs have festered and they've taken control of the community because there's no rule of law. And that's basically, the communities are afraid to call law enforcement because law enforcement will come in, investigate, but they'll leave. And the community's still under siege by the gangs.
That was one thing that came up a lot in my own interviews, is that families and the communities were no more trusting of the police and the military than they were of the gangs themselves. The police and military had detained some of the young men that I interviewed simply because they were on the street at night. So in these cases, they were working in the fields, it was harvest season, and they were beat. There are multiple cases of police abuse. The San Blas massacre that was well documented by Alfaro is not the only one, that's just the one that they investigated, and they received death threats in response and actually had to leave the country as a result. A report I'm working on is on harm that's been done to deportees, like Alex mentioned he encountered. And there are several cases in which men dressed in black in bulletproof vests with ski masks entered, told all the young youth at a soccer field to take off their shirts, and shot everyone with a tattoo dead. So the police and military, it's true by law, cannot just defend themselves, but it's also true that there's been a disconcerting effort to blame all of those who have been murdered for somehow being associated with gangs, when in fact several journalists, Jorge Beltran Luna of El Diario de Hoy, have proven that the majority of victims are not in any way associated with gangs. And even if they were, this isn't a solution. You can't just have extrajudicial killings. You can't be executioner and jury in one moment. And there's a lot of that going on right now.
No, I would like to make something very clear. In a situation that is going on with El Salvador of extreme violence, and in which, for example, the police are being killed in their days off, being pursued to their home offices and killed there, this is a very difficult situation, and of course, people can do things that they shouldn't do. So I'm not going to say that there might not be examples of abuse, and even perhaps of this type of executions, but they are examples. What I can clearly assure you is that it is not the policy of the government, nor of the security forces, to do this as it was during the during the years of the Civil War,
when there were
we had death squads that definitely were together with the security forces, and that was a clear policy. This is definitely not the situation right now.
Malika, go ahead.
I want to broaden this out just a little bit based on what community is telling us. And this is one tweet that emphasizes what other people are saying. This is from Peter. He says, gang culture is a result of social neglect, disempowerment, and lack of positive models in poor communities. It's a social ill. So you pick up on that theme in this next tweet from Tanya, whose family is from El Salvador. She says, I have family in El Salvador, and it's a struggle to keep young people in schools because gangs are good at recruiting. Few prospects, even after graduation, or money that can save their families. She says that thankfully she and her family have a little bit of money that they can help with, but many families don't have that same help, and gangs have targeted them for break-ins, harassment, etc. So Maria, I want to go to you with that because she talks about what it's like for children, and I want to take this back there, recruitment, and how young some of the people entering into these gangs are, because the ambassador mentioned prevention, and so people online are saying, well, when does prevention start?
Okay, yes. It's very interesting that right now, I guess, that in the first moment, or I don't know if technically, but like in the first phase of formation of gangs, definitely happened because of different factors that they have already mentioned, the lack of opportunities, lack of jobs, etc. But right now, I guess we're getting into like a second generation of people in gangs. What I mean with this is that now the adults in gangs, now they have children. And these children are getting into this culture of getting easy results with easy doing things. For example, their parents, sometimes they ask them like, are you hungry? And if you're hungry, go and ask to that lady for food. And if she says no, then tell them that I am your father, that your father is part of a gang. And then they start learning how to get things
so it's basically gang families. Maria, let me show everybody something that you sent to us. This is a letter here, and these are sort of little notes that get put into your homes where you live. Can you actually translate this for us and tell us what it is?
Well, this is one of the kind of messages that some of the communities find in different places, sometimes like in cars or in specific places like in the police station, and are kind of in this specific note where they are establishing a curfew, like a specific period of time, especially during the night, I think, from 6 p.m. to in the morning. I didn't read well, but
yeah, basically telling you
they say that
stay off
people
the streets.
can't go out.
Right.
That people can't go out during that period of time.
Okay. All right. So Maria, you get these little notes around your homes. You're told not to go places, not to do things. I'm just wondering here, Alex, how do you get people out of this gang culture? You got out. You used to be in a gang, like a big one.
Right, and the fortunate thing is that I'm in the United States. I'm in Los Angeles, and in Los Angeles, there's been a 6, 7 generation of gang membership in some gangs that are older, 100 years old. And we find that, you know, when you're a grandfather, you can't go with a stick trying to beat up another grandfather asking them where you're from. You know, so you kind of aged out. And that kind of resonates in the other younger generations. The issue also, it's safer. It's wider. Los Angeles is wider. You know, there's safe areas that you can go to. Now, El Salvador, it's different because, as Maria was saying, we're going into the second generation of getting involved. The peace truce that took place in El Salvador in 2012, we were hoping that could be that moment in time that you could break that cycle.
And that was a truce between the authorities and
between the two gangs.
It was a truce between gangs.
And there were two big gangs, M18.
And MS-13.
And MS-13. Okay.
And that was hoping that could be the slash in the cycle of violence in which could stop a second generation from coming in.
Yeah.
Now, we find ourselves that in El Salvador, there is ways in which some of the gang members have left the gang primarily through faith, religion, choosing religion has been one thing, and then others that have been calmed down, where they still talk to gang members and they say, look, I'm not gonna get involved, and they don't, they take it seriously. And they have been ways.
70,000 people is the estimate in gangs in El Salvador.
Yes.
What are you going to do about it?
Well, that's why I said it's a very complicated and difficult
huge
issue. But I want to say this. There are already also interesting experiences going on in El Salvador regarding the process of rehabilitation and reintegration.
Yeah, because I was wondering, because you gave us the strategies,
I
wasn't sure
yes,
if it was happening.
I'm going to mention a very concrete and specific example.
Yeah, please give us an example.
There's an entrepreneur, a Salvadorian entrepreneur,
yeah.
who was providing 350 jobs in his enterprise to members that were coming out from the gangs. Now what he's doing is something very interesting. He's opening a new business. It's a dairy plant to process. Yeah. And he's talking with the schools around the area and talking with the sons of the gang members and arranging with the schools that the sons of the gang members can go to school, receive education, that the parent has to go first give permission for his son or daughter to go to that program, goes eventually to some of the meetings at the school, and then the kids there receive mental attention, values, etc., etc. This is already going on, and I think that is one of the ways to go. It is working because what these people, the people working on this, tell me is, you know, the gangs members say, yeah, perhaps I don't have any more hope. Yeah. I'm going to be in prison the rest of my life. But I don't want my son or my daughter to continue to live the life that I left and that I lived and that my father lived. So that is where I think if we put our efforts and our resources, that's where we can confront
It's nice to hear a little glimmer of hope here. Malika, what do you have?
So that's one measure of success. People online are saying, well, we also need to make sure that we're pointing the finger at the United States. So Alex, I'm going to pose this tweet to you. This is someone who says, lots of these gang members came to the United States as children, and I know that also describes your story. They turned to crime in the USA, this person says, and then the USA deported them, he says, dumped in El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, of course. So we see this story of coming to the United States, being deported. What role of responsibility do you think the U.S. should play or does play in this?
Well, I believe that the United States have not played a real solid role when it has to do to the other pieces that the ambassador is talking about, the prevention, the intervention, the reintegration. They played a major role in what has to do with the suppression, with initiatives that they have put into practice here that have failed. You have over 1,500 gangs in Los Angeles County and over 100,000 gang members, you know, and how can you go and say that you've been successful in your initiatives? And those are the ones that are being consulted now to the consultants in Central America, a failed policy. So we see that it's important that the United States takes responsibility to support initiatives that has to do with reentry, intervention, right, and prevention, and kind of stay away and see what those countries could come up with instead of imposing policies such in CARC, such in other initiatives that they have in Central America through the Northern Triangle, in which they're imposing countries to do certain things a certain way.
Let me show you something. This is Maria's walk to work earlier on today. She took pictures as she walked to work. Have a look here on my laptop. Maria, we're just going to scoot through some pictures. Here we've got, tell me about the graffiti on the wall. What's that say?
Well, that is some of the things that people use to protect their houses.
Okay.
People, well, when the crime and the violent situation started to get worse, then we started taking some measures.
Okay.
And suddenly people started closing the streets, for example, where they lived with some gates or installing security cameras or hiding security guards.
I'm clicking through some more of the pictures you sent us, Maria. So there's one here. It's got garages with barbed wire on the top, more barbed wire here. This is interesting. Security guard hiding his face because he's afraid, Maria?
Well, it's what people do to protect their houses, and so it also depends on where you live and what is your, I mean, what you can afford to have in your house.
Sure.
I just wanted to take some of what you were talking before about. There are different causes and different
So Maria, we're going to take that, because I know it's a big conversation. We're going to take that to our post show at stream.aljazeera.com, because I want to take you, the ambassador, Alex and Elizabeth, and continue our conversation there. Malika, how did our audience, our online audience, react to this conversation so far?
Well, I'll end this with this tweet as a reaction. This is from Salvador. He says, the social fabric of El Salvador needs to be rebuilt, and I see no initiatives from the government to do this. So we'll talk about community and local initiatives.
Sure. We'll be talking about gangs in El Salvador and actually in the US and Central America in our online post show, stream.aljazeera.com. Thanks for watching. Welcome back. This is the Stream's online post show. We're talking about El Salvador's gang violence, and we ended with Maria. Maria, you had a little bit more to say. Finish your thought.
Yes, thank you. No, I wanted to talk more about what you were saying. Yes, there are different causes and different factors why people join the gangs. And as we were telling that, some of them are because people are in need of money or in need of opportunities. But I also wanted to talk about the family structure. Yes, there are families. We have seen that some common characteristics between people in gangs is that they come from dysfunctional families, and I guess that it's a whole country faces many challenges. Sometimes when we think that it's just a problem of institutions of the government, and we start seeing about what the police should do, and so we're not seeing like the big picture.
Yeah.
Preventing violence involves creating educational opportunities, creating opportunities to have jobs. And as Mr. Ambassador was saying, we're all working together in coordination with the government, but in organizing also the communities, the families.
Tell us about how you organize, Maria, tell us about how you're organizing the communities, because there's something that you told us a little bit earlier on, which is about children who can't get to school because of the violence in their neighborhood, and how they get their homework to school, because there are workarounds that you have to do when you live somewhere where it's really dangerous to go out and about. Tell us about homework, for instance.
Yes, well, in my experience with UNICEF, for example, what we do is organizing the communities, because they have like community boards, and in those boards they discuss different things. But we have added to their agenda the situation of children out of school in their communities. What they do is that they find individual cases and they report them to the municipalities. And the municipality then goes to their houses and asks them why they leave the school. If it's a security situation, what they do is organize with the police so they can go with them in their way to and from school to their houses. And they also, the police has an agreement with the Ministry of Education in which they go into the schools and give some training on the risks and opening up the police so that children are able and are not afraid of going with them in case if they need any help.
That's a really fascinating insight into how kids are experiencing life in parts of El Salvador. Malika, what do you have?
Well, our community is picking up on a point that we raised a little bit earlier. I want to bring you in here because our community is picking up on a point that I have to get in here. We did mention it, but this is something that they're really interested in, and that is that U.S. role and what role it has to play really in this issue of gangs in El Salvador. So one of the things you mentioned earlier, Alex, was the U.S. push to annihilate these gangs, and that was a comment made by former New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani. I have that article on my laptop here. It was his advice to El Salvador that the gangs have to be annihilated to boost security. So we got responses to that quote. This is a Facebook comment we got from Joe, and I'll pose it to you, Elizabeth. Joe says, gangs definitely need targeting. A broken window policy, that was Rudy Giuliani's policy, providing security, etc. That could all help, but a mass militarized response like Mexico, this person uses as an example, will only bring a civil war worse than the drug war. So I'm interested in your thoughts on that annihilation, that strong-handed policy.
Right, so U.S. policy in the region has traditionally been very militarized, and that's problematic because, as you've cited, there are as many as 70,000 gang members in El Salvador. There's another 250 to 400,000 family members and friends of those gang members, and as we've all mentioned, it is a complicated situation in which the gangs provide services that may not be available elsewhere. The U.S. traditionally, so speaking historically in Latin America, has always invested in a small elite And that's why we see the economic inequality that's in the region. Also important to this problem is the civil war that was in El Salvador. There's a large amount of trauma that still exists that's carried over from that war, that's carried over from prior events that the U.S. principally funded. And this is related to U.S. responsibility in the communities to which migrants arrived in the past and continue to arrive. They're often our poorest neighborhoods. Oftentimes migrants are working 2 and 3 jobs a day. They're unable to provide their children who have seen and undergone a lot of trauma the support that they necessarily need. And most of them end up being incredibly successful, but a few need additional support that they're just not getting. And this is something that the United States is repeating right now, both in our country and the types of policies that we fund. But I did want to follow up just on the number of children that are having to drop out of school because of gang threats that they've received. In my own interviews, around 70 had to drop out out of 322 because they'd received threats or there was a gang presence inside the school. As great an idea as it is to have police escorts, as I mentioned, a lot of times families and kids don't trust the police either. Now, it's really important for me to point out that the ambassador is correct. More police have been murdered this year than any other year prior. And there are really good agents who are trying to do their job and they get targeted, the same with the military. But there's also a large amount of corruption that's going to take years to root out because it took years to be built into the system. So, it's not an easy solution, but I think that at the root, economic and social development is what has to be the target, and that's a strategy that the U.S. really hasn't encouraged historically.
I would like to follow up on that comment. And regarding the U.S., I think that historically the U.S. has focused almost exclusively in the aspect of drug interdiction and security concerns. That has been the policy for the past at least 20 years. Right now, we are seeing a change in this policy. For the first time, at least in the past 20 years, the U.S. is starting to understand that if you really want security, you have to have stability in the region, and the stability goes through economic development. So that is why President Obama has supported the Plan for the Alliance for Prosperity for the Northern Triangle, which is a plan that was drafted by the 3 countries of the Northern Triangle, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, to address the root causes of migration. And this is why this is also a matter that's important to the U.S. Last year, you had 60,000 kids, young kids, unaccompanied kids, reaching the border, the southern border. 60,000. 60,000, coming basically from the three countries of the Northern Triangle. This was a sign of alarm, and that's when the presidents of the 3 countries decided to draft this plan to confront the root causes. The plan is already going on. We are implementing the plan. It has the support of the United States, and for me the most important change is that it is not only focusing on security concerns, but it is focusing on creating better jobs, creating more jobs, investing in human capital, particularly education, health, environment, and very importantly, strengthening our institutions, that is our fiscal capacities, our capacity to combat corruption and to be transparent in the use of public funds.
Alex.
But
I believe that although that is true in somewhat, we still find that there's 2 main points to this, in which has this the mass deportation of individuals going down to a country that does not have the infrastructure to integrate those people with employment, with housing, has created the wave of migrant children seeking out. What we've seen is that in El Salvador, the export are our people. Our people have become the export, in which they come and they make it, they provide to the country. They provide with the remittances. And I think that needs to change. So in regards of...
Is there anything the ambassador said that you think that makes total sense? I like what he just said there.
Well, obviously, I think that when the United States starts looking at prevention, intervention, because it's an effort that they've been doing here. Most recently, Obama also went to the prisons and seen that mass incarceration has not worked. You know, they're turning the tide on the war on drugs, which has been the result of mass incarceration worldwide. we have seen in Latin America, the war on gangs is what has stabilized many countries. And that's what we've seen. So the change in attitude in the United States, because has been one that they need to start changing. So if they start changing it here, they need to change it in Central America, or what is known as the Northern Triangle.
Elizabeth, we're almost out of time, but briefly, what did you want to add?
Right. I do think that there are certain weaknesses to the plan for prosperity. Obviously, the region could benefit from a $1 billion investment. The problems that I see with it are, one, that 1/3 of that budget is still geared towards security and militarization. Second, it doesn't have a sufficient voice from the grassroots communities and organizations, and tends to follow this strategy that the U.S. has used in primarily talking to the elite and the business elites and developing those sectors. And yes, that's important, but there's also a lot of grassroots
Hold tight for a moment. Let me just check if that's true. Ambassador, do you have people like Alex as you're working through how to deal with the gang issue in El Salvador? Do you have former gang members, people who are working in local communities, to tell you how they need help?
I'm sure there are. I mean, there's all these programs of prevention that are going on. Some very interesting, others that perhaps haven't been so very successful.
Sure.
We have now have implemented the concept of community policing.
Yeah.
It's
what does that
over
look like?
80% of the territory, and it is basically the idea that the policeman has to be an actor in the community. That he is somebody who lives there and is and works with the community, so that he has the trust of the community and is an actor in the improvement of the community.
Wow.
That is something that we are. It's a new approach. It's already implemented. Obviously, you cannot implement this strategy in the most dangerous.
I hear a lot of implementation in this conversation.
In the most dangerous areas
so,
of the country, because it's very important. I just wanted to mention it's very important
nice, safe
what was
areas,
said.
which is a good start, I suppose, so you don't create new gang members.
But that's the whole concept of prevention. It's like in health.
Course,
it's like in health.
All right. I want to scream. I'm not even Salvadorian. Okay. How many generations is this going to take? Are we going to be talking about this in 20 years' time?
I hope so not. I hope not so. But it's definitely we're going to be living with this situation.
Realistically, though, we could be very honest.
2 or 3 years.
2 or 3 years?
Well, yes, I think so.
Alex?
Not perhaps at the levels that we're seeing right now,
right?
Because hopefully there is going to be an improvement. But as I said, these are complex issues. There are no easy solutions, and they will take time.
I'm just
but I think we are moving on the right direction.
How long does poor Maria have to wait before she can go to the beach and not get kidnapped? Alex, how long is this going to take?
Well, I think that there was, and correct me, Ambassador, but there was a plan that this effort in regards of military and police to go after the gangs in this suppressive
how long is this going to take, Alex?
It's going to be for the end of 2016 was the initial.
Is this going to happen in our lifetimes?
Look, if we continue with the policies and looking up to the United States and the policies that they use, they haven't fixed this problem in 100 years.
Oh, my goodness. Okay, Elizabeth, where were you with this? How long is this going to take? There's a strategy here. People are working on this.
It's a long time to create. It's going to take a long time to correct. And ultimately, unless we try something differently than what we've been trying in the past, we're not going to address it. One thing that specifically needs to be addressed is the deeply rooted corruption in each of these countries, and one way to do that would be through the impunity courts that we saw quite successful in Guatemala, that's received a great amount of pushback in Honduras and El Salvador. But I mean, also this economic and social development has to be the focus.
And that Elizabeth, you made that point clear, and we made that point very clear on this show. Maria,
and
for you.
That is what's different between the other policies of strictly strong hand policies.
Absolutely. Clicking through these pictures on your way to work here, Maria, when do you think you'll be able to walk to work and not see evidence of gang violence around your neighborhood? What year will that be?
I think that we don't have to think it as like a specific problem. We have to think about it as a cycle. You were already talking about lack of education leads to lack of jobs and leads to looking for new opportunities, maybe going to another country or maybe joining the gangs. And that's why the solution is not just to get more police officers to the streets and not just military people to the streets, but to strengthen all the protection system in El Salvador. The Ministry of Education.
How long is that going to take, Maria? Well,
sorry?
How long is this going to take? Are you going to be an old woman before this happens?
Yeah, I'm really sure that I'm pretty sure, and I hope it happens like in the next 5-year tops.
Yeah,
I'm sure that
would be good. That would be amazing.
There is there's
Maria,
a country plan in
Elizabeth,
order to get that.
Alex, and Ambassador, thank you for. I know it's a really hard topic to talk about, and it's really complex, and you helped us unpack the complexities, and it's not as simple as some people may think. Malika, what do you have?
Femi, you asked how long is it going to take. This is Salvador's answer. He says, until corruption is addressed and proper funding is dedicated to the rebuilding of the Salvadoran society, no solution is possible. But slightly uplifting note on this next tweet from Sobramesas, who says, thank you for talking about El Salvador, such beautiful people, plagued unfortunately by vicious cycles of violence and poverty.
Thank you, guests, for being part of today's edition of The Stream. And that point, everybody agrees on the panel. Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you.